Hello and welcome to the third and final set of notes in Unit 3 on Progressivism. The title of this video being on Makin democracy, because we've been focusing on the problems that rose in America out of industrialization, with things with the political corruption and the problems that rose out of industrial capitalism. So now we're going to focus even more so on that political corruption, but how that kind of changed America into making us into the democracy that we are today. So by the end of this set of notes, you need to be able to explain key political reforms at the city, state, and federal levels during the Progressive era, because those reforms were happening at all three levels, all three being very important. And then discuss the provisions of the amendments that arose out of this time period, including the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th amendments. So we're going to start by talking about what political corruption at this time was before we can talk about how it was reformed, and that there was a lot of political corruption, particularly at the city level. And we had what we call now political bosses, and that these were at the city level. They got people to vote for them by doing them favors. So, for instance, if I was going to be running for the mayor, I might do favors for a construction company, or if I wanted someone, like a big group of people, to vote for me, I would use that construction company to get them a lot of deals, and there are a lot of political corruption that way. Then we have what we call a political machine, and the political machine were essentially the boots on the ground, the people and the larger groups of people that were working to get these political bosses into office. And the biggest political machine was actually Tammany Hall in New York City. This was the most famous one. And so the political bosses and political machines were using all kinds of corrupt ways to make a difference or to get anything done, which in turn meant they didn't get a whole lot done because it was really inefficient. The most famous political boss is pictured here in a political cartoon by Thomas Nast. This is, like I said, Boss Tweed in New York City, who's sitting kind of under City Hall but has loads of money that he's sitting on, and you see his ring and his cane because he used a lot of corrupt ways to benefit himself. And this political cartoon by Thomas Nast showing the Tammany ring, and was titled "Who Stole the People's Money?" Twas him, because everybody is pointing at everyone, because everyone was corrupt, everyone was at fault at this time. And this is significant because the progressives wanted to change this. They wanted to do something quickly about it. So we see a man, one of our muckrakers, which is Lincoln Steffens, powers what men seek, and any group that gets it will abuse it. And so he very much shed light on the political corruption at the city level, particularly with a book that he wrote in 1904, The Shame of the Cities. His quote being, "Defending grafters in Minneapolis, originating corruption in Pittsburgh, sharing with bosses in Philadelphia, deploring reform in Chicago, and beating good government with corruption funds in New York. He's a self-righteous fraud, this big business man. He is the chief source of corruption." And so he's calling out in this book the corruption at the local level, and this very much influences and fuels the government reform that we then see in the Progressive era, because people are ready for a change at this point. So again, the impact just being the government reform, and that people feel betrayed by their government and are ready to make that change. So what are the progressives' take on things? And that they saw corruption as incredibly inefficient. That corruption that we see, especially at the city level, leads to inefficiency. Because if I'm hiring my friends because I know them, or people who have done me favors in the past, I'm not hiring people that really know what they're doing. They just need a job. I put them in that position and they get paid, and they aren't really good at it. So it leads to a lot of inefficiency and unqualified workers working in the government where things need to get done. So the progressives said, we need experts. We need to find experts to fill these jobs and have a little bit higher expectations for them than just hiring your friends, because things need to get done. So this leads to the city commissioner plan as well as a city manager plan. which both are positions where you're hiring specific experts to run specific aspects of city government and kind of promoting and increasing that efficiency. Then we see a lot of state reforms. We see a lot of reforms at the state level as well, and you do need to know all of these. This first one being the secret ballot, which nowadays when you go to vote, you have the little box that you go to. No one can see your ballot. It's very private, right? Well, that didn't used to exist. It used to be all very open, where political bosses were heckling people and persuading people to vote for them. Then we have this idea of initiative. So it allows voters to petition state legislatures in order to consider a bill desired by citizens. So an example in the state of Ohio recently was when a bunch of voters petitioned, they got a bunch of signatures to get a bill considered for the legalization of marijuana in the state of Ohio. And then in turn, initiative and referendum being related here, referendum then allows the voters to decide if a bill or proposed amendment should be passed, and then they vote on it. So initiative is petitioning to get the bill on the docket, essentially, and then the referendum being the citizens then vote on it. And we then had, in the state of Ohio, a referendum on the legalization of marijuana, and that did not pass. And then we have this idea of recall, so it allows voters to petition, again, get a bunch of signatures to have an elected representative removed from office, and we've seen this recently in the state of Michigan, where citizens of the state of Michigan were trying to recall and then remove the Michigan governor after the Flint water ordeal, where they were essentially saying the governor allowed and knew that the water was contaminated by lead in the Flint area and causing a lot of really bad problems there. And then finally we have direct primary. This ensures that voters select candidates to run for office rather than party bosses, and that the way that it used to be, the party bosses would appoint essentially who is going to run, and so now you have a direct primary where the voters select those candidates to represent each party, and then they finally vote on the actual candidate as well. So then we see during the progressive era a bunch of federal amendments, right? So we've talked about in our notes then with Lincoln, Steffens, the muckraker, and the progressive take on inefficiency and political corruption at the city level. And then we talk about the reforms at the state level with those 5 vocabulary terms. And now we'll finally talk about the amendments to the Constitution being at the federal level, understanding that you have to know all 3 levels. So the 16th Amendment in 1913 granted Congress the power to tax income. So it allowed Congress to collect that federal income tax. And that if you make a salary or wage, a certain amount of that is going to go to the government. The 17th Amendment, also in 1913, provided for the direct election of U.S. senators. Prior to the 17th Amendment, party representatives would appoint senators. And so a lot of times those party representatives were big political bosses and very corrupt. So the senators that would go into an incredibly important role in the federal government had no idea what they were doing, again, leading to the inefficiency. The 18th Amendment in 1919 is prohibition. It prohibited making, selling, or transporting alcohol, which we'll talk about here in just a second. And finally, the 19th Amendment in 1920, which provided women's suffrage or women's right to vote, which we'll also talk about here in a minute. So let's start talking about these different amendments. The last 2, we'll focus on the 18th and 19th. The first one, let's focus on the 18th Amendment, which was fueled by the temperance movement. The temperance movement is what gives us prohibition, which was the amendment to the Constitution to prohibit alcohol. So prohibition being laws banning the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcoholic beverages. The groups that supported this included the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League. They had been around for quite some time and finally resulted in prohibition. But let's talk about the why, and that why would they want to do this? Because nowadays we understand that prohibition, this amendment did not last long, right? Because alcohol manufacture, sale is all legal in the United States now. But at the time, with all of the societal ills and problems that were going on, especially these two groups blamed alcohol and the production and use of alcohol. So they said that alcohol was to blame for many problems of the time, societal problems of the time, like gambling, poor working conditions, poverty, domestic abuse that women were facing in their homes. Again, all of this resulting from alcohol, and so they wanted it banned. So the next thing we'll talk about is the 19th Amendment and kind of how the movement that allowed the 19th, or that resulted in the 19th Amendment. And this was the women's suffrage movement. And it actually started way before 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed. And again, this is the suffrage, women's suffrage movement, which is the right to vote. And those early leaders were Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And it starts in the 1850s. Okay, so the suffrage movement starts in the 1850s because women organized around the abolition movement and banning slavery with the Civil War and post-Civil War, and also the temperance movement with the 18th Amendment and banning alcohol. And they realized, especially after abolition, that, you know, we've been working so hard to get black men the right to vote. Well, we can't even vote ourselves. And so that turned into, and they formed the National American Suffrage Association, where they worked for women's suffrage. Again, Susan B. Anthony being a big leader of this movement, one of the first and best known. And she actually, one of the methods she uses is that she actually dresses up as a man. And she goes and votes in a presidential election. She's arrested and jailed. She's also fined $100, which she actually did not pay. So she was a pretty influential and amazing woman, the tactics that she used to kind of start this movement. So the women's suffrage movement starts officially in 1848, but we don't see the 19th Amendment and women earning that right to vote, or women getting that right to vote, until 1920, which is long after Susan B. Anthony and even Elizabeth Cady Stanton have passed. So this turns into the National American Suffrage Association, which had existed, but it's now under new leaders at the time of the 19th Amendment being passed. It's under Carrie Chapman Catt and Lucy Stone. And then we also see a group form which was working towards the same end goal but had different methods, which was National Women's Party under the leader Alice Paul. So let's talk first about Carrie Chapman Catt and Lucy Stone under the National American Suffrage Association. So their methods being that they wanted to go state by state, so working in each of the states to get them to kind of approve an amendment to allow women's suffrage, and that they thought that kind of slow and steady movement means that what was then the 19th Amendment is inevitable. It will certainly happen. They used more ladylike methods and tactics to send the message and work towards women's suffrage. They did not want to protest the president, President Wilson at the time. They wanted to keep him on their good side, and so they did not protest. On the other side, we have the National Women's Party under Alice Paul, and they were a little bit more extreme in their methods, in that they wanted a constitutional amendment. They were not okay with moving slowly from state to state. They said, we want a constitutional amendment now. And so they, again, adopted more extreme techniques like heckling, protesting, including protesting President Wilson. With the dawn of World War I, then becomes a wartime president, and it's seen as very unpatriotic to protest during a war, particularly protesting a president during a war. And they then use hunger strikes. So they're actually protesting, and they're protesting, like I said, during wartime and a wartime president. And Alice Paul and some of her kind of colleagues with the National Women's Party are arrested and put in jail for 7 months, where they go on a hunger strike. They refuse to eat to kind of further push that message that they were trying to push, and they gained a lot of sympathizers from it because of the abuses that they faced in jail because of that hunger strike. And out of that kind kind of public sympathy and the government listening, we have the passage of the 19th Amendment and women's suffrage is successful. So at this point, you want to stop and answer the prompts on your guided notes, and then when I see you next, I will give you a stamp. Just again, make sure you get those summary questions answered. Everybody have a great day.